The date was April 26, 1986, when, in the early hours of Saturday morning, the history of mankind would change forever. The location was the Chernobyl nuclear power plant, Ukraine. The accident that the nuclear power industry said would never happen occurred at precisely 1:23 a.m. when reactor number 4 exploded. What had taken place would later be labelled by the United Nations as the greatest environmental disaster in the history of humanity. Radioactive radiation emitted was about 200 times higher than the total emissions from the atomic bombs that fell over Nagasaki and Hiroshima in August of 1945. The nearest town of Pripyat would only see its people evacuated 2 days after the disaster, and by that time the damage had already been done, with them having been exposed to high levels of radiation. On the immediate aftermath of the incident, one local report stated that the radiation was so strong that a firefighter named Vladimir Provik would experience his eyes changing colour from brown to blue. Sweden was the first country to inform the world of the disaster after the Soviet government initially secretly covered the accident, but there was no way the implications of such an event could be contained for long. There is consensus that a total of around 30 people died from immediate blast trauma and acute radiation syndrome in the seconds to months after the disaster respectively, with 60 in total in the decades since. And to this day, nearly 5 million people still live in contaminated areas. Radioactive rain fell as far away as Ireland. Ukraine, Belarus and Russia were the most affected countries, where a huge 63% of the radioactive fallout from Chernobyl landed. The city of Pripyat was eventually abandoned by humans due to high levels of radiation, and the city would become home to an eclectic combination of wolves, wild horses, beavers, wild boar and other animals. To this day, animals that live in the safety zone around Chernobyl's nuclear power plant, being a radius of 3 kilometers, have higher mortality, increased genetic mutations and decreased nativity. The nearby forest near the disaster is now called the Red Forest, after high levels of radiation killed the trees and left large areas of pale red dead pine. Radioactive substances remained, encapsulated in a decaying cement sarcophagus that was built over the reactor after the accident. A new solid shell was subsequently built over the top, but is only expected to last for 100 years. You can now book a trip to the Chernobyl zone, with tourist agencies arranging day trips in the abandoned city of Pripyat, right next to the wrecked nuclear power plant. Pripyat is a heavily contaminated city and will remain abandoned by humans, with residues of the dangerous plutonium remaining in the area, a substance that has a half-life of 24,000 years. In the contaminated areas, the Chernobyl accident affects every aspect of people's lives. Radiation from Chernobyl's nuclear power plant is found in the food they eat, in the milk and water they drink, in schools, parks and playgrounds, and in the woods whose firewood they burn to keep warm. Given the severity of the incident, you would expect the other Chernobyl reactors to also be shut down immediately. This was not the case. The operation of the 3 other reactors at the nuclear power plant was resumed and operated for a further 13 years until finally closed in 2000. The nuclear industry and the governments of Ukraine, Russia and Belarus still intend to spend billions on nuclear projects while neglecting their responsibility to support the survivors of the Chernobyl accident. 25 years later, the nuclear accident in Fukushima, Japan, reminded us that the risk of another accident like Chernobyl still exists wherever nuclear power is in use. The long-lived radionuclides released by the Chernobyl accident mean the disaster continues almost 40 years later and still affects the lives of millions of people.